You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 504 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I have a lot of news to cover. The past couple weeks on the show, the content has been a little different. Part of that is because I had the 500th episode. If you haven't listened to that, everybody who's listened really tells me they really like it. I interview Scott Horton, and he just rants about the lessons we should have learned from Star Wars and police abuse in the U.S. It's really a must listen, so if you haven't heard it yet, check that out. I've also had Will Porter on the show a couple times to talk about the George Floyd protests and, the Black Lives Matter movement, the police abuse fallout there. And then along with Joanne Leone, I interviewed retired U.S. Army Major Danny Scherzen on his experience at these protests in Kansas City. So there's a lot of interesting content in the past week, and that also means I haven't been covering some of the wars going on in the Middle East that I usually update every day on the show. So there's going to just be a lot of news stories, but also there's still a lot happening in the U.S. and I want to touch on that first. So I'm going to get right into it. Just make sure you share the show over at the Libertarian Institute. I also write the news roundup over there, which is just the most important stories every day, summarized into, just a couple sentences, and the link there at the end if you want to check it out and read it. If you read those things, make sure you share them around. If people are informed on what's going on in the world, they might feel a little bit more ambitious in changing it. So the first story I have today, and I'll link to this article in the show notes page, is one by Jordan Smith, published over at The Intercept, explaining how while the term for the weapons that police are using to suppress riots are termed less than lethal, they often produce life-threatening or potentially even lethal outcome. She details in her article mostly abuse that's happening in Austin, Texas, where one man was shot in the back of the neck with, I believe, a rubber bullet, and it caused a fractured skull and, bleeding, and he's got a lot of damage. A young man was shot with a beanbag round, I believe, in the head, and he was, again, fractured skull, frontal cortex damage. So, that's really serious stuff. And, these are really serious injuries that are going to take these people years to recover from it. And they'll probably never be back to how they were before they were injured. There's also a few people who have lost eyes, including journalists. And there is this case, I believe, in Ohio, and we're still waiting on the full autopsy report to confirm these conclusions, but it appears that a young woman who attended a protest was sprayed in the face with some kind of mace or chemical agent, and that combined with her pre-existing asthma caused her to go into a medical condition where she later ended up dying. It seems that there's no really other explanation or cause for her death, but I read in a local newspaper that it could take 8 weeks to get the autopsy report back, so I'm not sure what they're doing to this poor girl's body to figure out if she actually died of what they say. But it's very concerning that this happened and it killed someone. And if you watch the video and just see how almost for fun cops mace people, I mean, there's of course that meme picture, I think it's of a Occupy Wall Street, but some kind of campus protest. You have a whole bunch of young college students there detained and with their hands down or behind their backs, and the cop is walking by just for fun, macing them all in the face. And so if this is something that killed this young lady, then I think we should start talking to police officers and say, hey, if you mace somebody for no reason, that's going to be an attempted murder charge. So the other big thing going on with the protest movement is this situation in Seattle. If you just look on Twitter, hashtag Seattle Autonomous Zone, it appears what's going on is that some combination of the Black Lives Matter movement as well with just people looking to really do something different and have a revolution. I don't think this is solely a Black Lives Matter thing. And I don't want to just chalk it up to Antifa because Antifa is something that I don't think a lot of people who talk about really understand, including myself. And so while there may be some people who fly Antifa flags or have Antifa shirts involved in this, I don't know as far as like the actual group infrastructure how much support they have for this. But essentially they have seized several city blocks in Seattle, including a police precinct building that was abandoned by the police. This has been going on for a couple days now. It was, I believe, the morning Thursday, June 11th, that Trump tweeted about it for the first time. So it'll be interesting to see when, the police will finally act and try to, remove these people. I imagine they are kind of hoping that, the strategy from the police here is that if they let them camp out for a few days, eventually, it's Seattle, it rains a lot, it'll be cold at night, and the people will eventually leave. But in the meantime, this is a lot of businesses and other stuff within the territory that's occupied. So people own that property. They have businesses. Some of them, maybe could be open up. I don't know what the regulations and restrictions are in Seattle. So they're losing money. It looks like there's quite a bit of vandalism going on. They're not burning down buildings. It doesn't look like arson. It's not maybe a complete state of burn it down, that crazy way people use the word anarchy. That doesn't seem to be what's going on there. But at the same time, it doesn't seem that there's a firm set of rule of law, and there's, this apparent rapper or tagger. I've seen him labeled as both, but this guy, I've seen him in videos going around and essentially trying to keep order by, force and intimidation. And I guess they had theft of some of their food by homeless people. So it's not necessarily a stable situation going on there. While I'm a very strict libertarian and I really have no actual issue with, people claiming that, they want to live by their own individual rules. And I don't think it's necessarily a good idea right now to go out, take up guns and declare a portion of, property that you own your own state, because I think the, U.S. government will have a violent reaction to that. But in theory, people should be allowed to do that. That said, I don't think that's necessarily what's going on here. And while I'm very willing to, talk to the defund the police people and really try to, communicate the libertarian thoughts and ideas on how we restrain and get rid of police force, there's a great episode of the Free Man Beyond the Wall podcast that's hosted by Pete Quinones up at the Libertarian Institute, where he talks to Dale Brown, who provides a private security force to people in Detroit where cops don't show up when you need help. So, there are options out there, and I wish, the people in Seattle were pursuing that, but that doesn't seem to be the case. I'm very concerned that, this is going to have a violent outcome. And, as interesting as the situation is, I definitely recommend anybody get involved in. So on the first day, I believe, or the second day, the George Floyd protests, very early on in the movement, though, there was a case where a whole bunch of journalists and protesters' cars that were in this parking lot ended up with slashed tires, and there were accusations thrown around that it was Antifa, that it was the Boogaloo Boys, blaming the extremists on each side. Well, we now had the video footage, and it was the cop. So I guess there's no reason for a surprise, but at the same time, this is just another example of how lawless the Minneapolis police are, that they think that they could just go around and slash everybody's tires because they're out expressing their First Amendment rights is absolutely. Tires are expensive, and they were sticking knives in the sidewall, and so that's not something, a way that the tire could ever be repaired. They do that to an SUV, that could be an $800,000 bill for a family. Even more if we're talking about Minnesota, where it's probably important to have a good set of tires on that car for the winter. Huge bill that you're putting on a family in a time where so many people are stressed economically. It's unbelievable that they would do this, but you see this video and then you start to think, oh, well, that's definitely why, the people in Minneapolis want to, abolish their police department. One thing, me and Will recorded that show on Monday talking about how generally we, like the idea of defund the police. And then the next day, I believe head of the city council of Minneapolis came out and kind of laid out the fact that they really don't have any idea what's going to come after they disband the police department. which is unfortunate because I've seen real plans like proposed for this city, but she didn't have a single answer. And so I get why people are getting really turned off, with that movement right now. Because I think, the answer to people when they say, how will we defend ourselves? Because that's a natural right that every single person has. You can't just be like, shrug, you don't get to do that. You have to explain to people how they're going to defend themselves. And the lady was incapable of it. And so I guess it's unfortunate that they have such a kind of narrow-minded, or I would say so, unable to like kind of see what she needs to do to sell what she's trying to say. She only could see it from her perspective of why the cops need to go. I mentioned on the show in the past couple of weeks that this story developing out of Louisville where there was some kind of altercation, the police somehow got involved, and somehow there ends up being a shootout that kills a local business owner that owns a barbecue joint that appeared to be a kind of innocent guy standing by. I guess, the story is starting to come out, and it appears somebody from the National Guard actually fired the shot that killed him. As, there's this large movement that's around defund or disband police forces. We have Joe Biden proposing to give $300 million to police departments for training. One reason I think this is so absurd, there's been at least 3 or 4 examples where the police in riot gear have actually fired not less than lethal rounds, beanbags, tear gas, rubber bullets at nonviolent protesters who were also the people who were training them on like racial sensitivity and community policing. And so they literally go out and then shoot these people. And so it's just proof that, this isn't effective. And I think it's further proof that the way, you're going to actually make change is by holding police accountable criminally and financially, letting people sue them or, them going to jail when they, assault and kill people. In total, more than 10,000 Americans have now been arrested at these protests. It's very interesting that it appears none of them have been arrested for violating coronavirus lockdowns, which are still in effect, and apparently people are supposed to listen to and obey as long as they're not going to these protests. And I know I could spend an entire show on that media narrative and how, these health experts have come out and basically told people that it's okay to do this one thing and violate social distancing, but not anything else, that this one thing doesn't present a significant risk, but everything else does. You could say that this is important enough. That's one thing, but telling people that there's no risk to going out and protesting when, just 2 weeks ago that going out and protesting was killing anybody is very inconsistent. And I think really problematic, kind of if there's a quarantine or if there's like a virus in the next couple of years, that's more like a serious Black Death kind of thing, people aren't going to listen because this time they definitely cried wolf. ICE, that is our immigration enforcement, is planning to spend $18 million on new equipment, including, again, the less than lethal tasers, thousands of them they're going to procure. And so it's, we have this whole movement going on, defund the police, and yet somehow the police keep buying more and more weapons. I saw this video in Alabama, but I've seen at least 4 of these since the, George Floyd protests started. And I think it highlights something that I guess I often don't talk or never have talked about on the show when it comes to police abuse, but seems to be a real issue that is more, it's really exclusive to the African American community. And that is when they call the police, they get arrested. So this guy owns it looks like a liquor store, but who knows what it is. And, it says I'm being robbed. And so the police come and they arrest him. In no way does the guy look like he was robbing the store. He didn't act like it in any way. He's thankful that the police are there, and then they arrest him. It's quite, there was the other video where a store owner and a reporter were standing outside of a business, and they, flagged down police officers flying down the streets because this business is being looted and they're trying to protect it. And the police come and they arrest the store owners. And again, these are Black people. And so this is, I don't even understand how, police could possibly make these mistakes. They possibly don't slow themselves down to ask questions, but it's a real problem. And, again, this is another kind of story where you really had to start to sympathize with people who really just want to, get rid of and defund police at this point, because on net, they're not good. Hell, I would imagine that store owners probably made the decision sometime, if they're not getting robbed by a whole lot, well, you might as well not call the police, because there's a good chance that they come, they're going to end up arresting you, and you're going to lose more money on that than you would just letting the whoever rob you for a couple $100. In some bad news, the White House says it will not support reforms to qualified immunity. This isn't surprising, as the Trump administration seems to be going on this hashtag law and order platform when it comes to the protest. It's not a good situation. I think Trump trying to enforce law and order is only going to spur more resistance to him. I think the other kind of unfortunate effect here is that, in general, Americans view police violence less seriously than the mob violence or the kind of rioting and looting that goes on in the protest. And so if police go out there and beat some people and shoot people with, beanbags and rubber bullets, and then rioting and looting starts, a lot of Americans, I think, are only going to be concerned about, the rioting and looting. And so in a way, I think this is going to, in a roundabout way, end up helping Trump, but spur more violence overall. I got another article I'll link to in the show notes page I won't spend a ton of time talking about, because Matt Blumenthal does such a good job in his article explaining it. But he talks about this concept again. I mentioned it on the show over the past couple of weeks, how American police have been trained in Israeli-fied is a way to say it, and now act more like an occupying force, especially, in the inner city neighborhoods where a lot of people are minorities, and it seems like there's a little bit of good news, although I haven't heard the full story here, so maybe somehow it's bad, but 80-year-old anti-war activist Liz McAllister, who has, I believe, served 17 months in jail and some time under house arrest for walking onto a U.S. naval base with nuclear armed submarines and carrying out a protest until they were arrested. They're accused of cutting the fence, and then I guess they dumped some blood and carried out other kinds of protests while on the base. Unfortunately, at their trial, Liz McAllister, as well as 6 other members, they are known as the Plowshare 7, were unable to use the defenses that they wanted to at the trial to state their case, the importance of abolishing nuclear weapons and how they're a threat to all humanity. And so they were convicted and possibly facing law and jail sentences. And so, you sleep a little better at night knowing that this, brave woman doesn't have to spend the rest of her life behind bars. I believe she will be under probation for a couple. In some big news that I'm sure I will talk about in the coming weeks as we find out the names here, but the Senate Judiciary Committee has voted to issue subpoenas in the Crossfire Hurricane inquiry. This could mean calling Peter Strzok, Andrew McCabe, James Comey, John Brennan, and others to talk about, the early investigation into the Trump campaign at the time, its origins, because it seems pretty obvious at this point that it was started inappropriately and done to undermine the campaign. The World Court is seeking to have a U.S. District Court force Facebook to release data on the accounts of Myanmar military officials that they say contains evidence of a 2017 ethnic cleansing campaign against a Muslim minority in Myanmar known as the Rohingya. Right now, there's about 1,000 of those people living in refugee camps in Bangladesh, and I understand the situation there is pretty horrific. I think that big typhoon that was moving up the coast of India was expected to hit that area of Bangladesh at some point. I haven't read any stories about it, but I would imagine there's a lot of suffering going on there. You would hope that Facebook would give up this information. I guess maybe one of the reasons that it's not publicly available at this point is Facebook actually took the accounts down. The U.S. is threatening sanctions against ships that carry Venezuelan oil, and just the threats alone have already turned away 2 ships, and looks like 3 more are changing their minds about picking up Venezuelan oil. So that's really unfortunate for the Venezuelan people who need income coming into their country so they could buy food and medicine, the things they need to deal with the rampant poverty in that country. The U.S. and Russia are planning to hold arms talks on June 22nd, so at the end of this month. Good news, because we need to save the New START treaty, which will expire in February and is the last remaining arms control agreement between the U.S. and Russia. And so extending that is highly important. China was invited to the talks, but they have said that they will decline. China being invited to the talks is significant because the reason that the treaty hasn't already been extended, it could be easily done so by just Trump and Putin agreeing, is because the U.S. wants China to get involved. China refuses. They say, hey, look, we only have a couple hundred nukes and you guys have a few thousand, so why would we enter into a treaty until your nukes are in the same range as ours? Seems like a decent point to me to make from the Chinese perspective. But yet the U.S. has really set that as a red line, saying that unless China's involved, we're not going to enter into nuclear talks. So it could be problematic, but we'll hope that in a couple of weeks after these talks, we have some positive news about the New START treaty. NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that the alliance is searching for like-minded partners in the Pacific to counter China. The U.S. also announced they're deploying 2 aircraft carriers to the Pacific, apparently to be prepared in case another COVID outbreak happens. I don't know what the thinking is of deploying ships to help with the COVID outbreak. It seems that sailing U.S. ships around the world, and especially these large aircraft carriers, that I understand that supplies come and go off the deck, and that it's not just like it's isolated like a submarine for 100 days at a time. Could easily have one of these outbreaks, and then it's very hard to treat aboard the ship, as we saw with the USS Theodore Roosevelt. Seems like it's just putting the U.S. in a logistically bad place and potentially harmful to U.S. troops. With the past few months just being absolutely insane news cycles as they've been, first with the coronavirus and then with the killing of George Floyd in protest aftermath, a huge development is happening that nobody has really talked about in enough importance, and that is Israel is going to start officially annexing the West Bank. It appears the plan at this time, although there's nothing official, is to start by annexing the large settlement colonies first, and then I guess they would eventually go up to the plan that was somewhat laid out in Trump's Deal of the Century, where Israel ends up with about 30%, but the best parts of the West Bank, more importantly, it would just isolate the Palestinian communities from each other, and a lot of the access and connecting areas would be Israel only. The Palestinians said that they will declare statehood if Israel moves forward with annexation. My guess is that this is kind of just going to be a move in name only. And the Israelis announced that even though the deal of the century is pretty much just a giveaway to them, that they're actually not going to follow it, and they're going to continue with settlement expansion through annexation. It was called to stop that process while Israel was annexing portions of the West Bank. The reason this is so important is because annexation is just another step in the oppression of the Palestinians. Recently, you had a young autistic Palestinian man who was taken out of the trash, fled from police, was shot first, in the lower body, and was then executed by the Israeli police when I guess he was unable to calm down and appease them in a, quick enough fashion, despite an advocate caregiver trying to explain to the police his situation. And so the injustice in Palestine and, in Israel for the Palestinian people is rampant to something that I think we can't even, fathom in the U.S. while looking at the hundreds of cases of police abuse that we see in the U.S. This is just beyond in such a horrific situation. The U.S. had announced sanctions on Iranian shipping in December. Those are now going to take effect. I'm not sure what prompted them to take effect now, if it's the fact that Iran is shipping crude oil to Venezuela, or if it, just logistically worked out. I know there were a lot of problems, international companies that, the U.S. is favorable towards, probably does a lot of business with the West and helps, everybody who's in power keep their stock prices, the companies they own very valuable are involved in that shipping, so they have to get rid of those contracts. That takes time, but those sanctions are now going to take effect. I'm sure further hurt the Iranian economy. In Turkey, President Erdogan ordered the arrest of another 414 coup plotters. This brings the total to 150,000 people being released from their jobs and over 80,000 people being jailed since the coup plot in 2016 and Erdogan's purge. Turkey is often celebrated as a NATO member and called kind of a democracy in the Middle East, but it's becoming very apparent that that isn't the case. A couple news stories on Iraq. Denmark is sending 285 troops to Iraq to be a part of the NATO training mission. They say these troops will be in non-combat roles. It seems like all the Western troops in Iraq are in non-combat roles, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's no danger, as so many of the troops that the NATO forces are around and embedded with are different Shia militias that the U.S. has, not the exact same groups, but the U.S. has also generally attacked the Shia groups. So I would imagine that there's the possibility for a green on blue style attack. Also, just the shelling by random actors in Iraq, potentially the Shia groups of Western military bases, occasionally kills people. So these, are non-hazardous roles. The influential Iraqi cleric Muqtada al-Sadr said that the U.S. needs to get its occupying forces out of Iraq. Apparently, the U.S. is entering into talks with Iraq coming up, and that is something on the Iraqi agenda, although Trump has been pretty insistent that he will not be withdrawing U.S. forces from Iraq without at least Iraq paying for the bases the U.S. put there, which doesn't seem like something the Iraqi government can afford at this time, since a lot of their funding comes from the U.S. It seems that fighting has restarted in the Idlib province of Syria. An interesting statement from Turkey saying that the jihadists are to blame. The jihadists have generally been backed by Turkey. And so, admitting that their troops are the ones causing the problem isn't a textbook out of the Turkish playbook, and so maybe it really is getting to the point where they can't control the al-Nusra fighters there. At least 40 people have been killed in that fighting. We also have important events coming out of Libya. Ceasefire talks are underway, so that's some good news. The bad news is it looks like the U.S. ally, Trump's favorite dictator, General al-Sisi, is sending 18 U.S.-made tanks into Libya to back up the warlord General Khalifa Haftar, whose forces have recently been pushed from the city of Tripoli and the surrounding area. So I think that weapons and those tanks could be significant and, make it less likely that Haftar would be willing, to sign a ceasefire, because he's got some big weapons coming in and maybe thinks he could change the battlefield. All right, that's what I got for you today. Make sure you share the show, libertarianinstitute.org. If you want to donate, you could do that over at Patreon. If you want to chat with me, there's a private Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus. Anybody wants to, come in the group, talk about anything foreign policy, that's absolutely welcome. But if you're just, you like the show and you want to come in and chat about other stuff, that's always cool too. I know we're all pretty isolated now with the COVID stuff, and anything to talk about, go in the group and we could chat. Let's see. I don't think I really have anything else to plug. I've been on a lot of other podcasts lately, as I should note. The ammo.com podcast hosted by Sam Jacobs. He had me on. I've gotten really good feedback about my appearance there. I was on the Decentralized Revolution podcast, and I did an appearance on the Rebel with the Cause podcast. So if you're looking for me talking about more stuff, especially since I've done a lot of interviews in the past week and not as many of these news shows, be sure to check those interviews out. And thanks everybody for tuning in.